Hello, and welcome to the Amongst Romance podcast, your window to everything Italy from an outsider's perspective. Join us each week as we navigate the Italian way of life and all the adventures that come along with it. So a couple days after we finished recording our last episode, I ended up going on Netflix and came across this movie called La Dolce Villa. It really made me think of the whole process of how buying a home in Italy is portrayed in movies versus the reality. So I thought today we could talk about it, especially when we compare, something like Under the Tuscan Sun, which is a older movie, but I think it's one of those ones that many people think of when they think of the idea of buying a home in Italy and how great it would be versus this one and our own experience.
Yeah, it's always funny seeing how easily they purchase homes in these movies, right? Obviously, they're not realistic in any manner. So, being exposed to the purchase of our own home, it's been pretty not very straightforward.
Do you think Italy is uniquely positioned as a place where those kind of dreams come true? Because I don't really recall seeing any other movies that are sort of going with that idea of a foreigner coming in, buying this property that they fix up, and, through the process of renovation, they overcome whatever challenge they came with originally, and everything works out and they live this perfect life. I think Italy is the only place I've seen in movies and television that they do that.
I don't think I've seen any other movies that really portray a country where it's so easy to purchase a home and live without any issues, right? I'd like to know who actually came up with this original idea and how it got so rooted into popular culture, living La Dolce Vita. It's not as easy as they make it or, at least portray it on the movies.
Do you think that this whole La Dolce Vita angle is the reason that Italy is so popular? I think that's a concept uniquely tied to Italy, right? Not other countries.
I think they romanticize Italy, right? A little too much. There is that romantic aspects of Italy and, the easy living and all that, but it still takes a lot of work and quite a bit of money to be able to just, purchase a home and renovate it however you want it. Let's not even talk about all the red tape you have to go through. If you do a lot of the things that they do in these movies where, hey, we're going to build this beautiful home, turn it into a B&B or, a vineyard and take care of it. Good luck with all that because you need to find the workers, then need to work the land. I'm pretty sure you're not going to do it yourself. There's maintenance. There's so many other things. Let's not even talk about things like getting a license to drive around in the first place. They don't really talk about that, and I understand, but it's not realistic at all, in my opinion.
There are countries in Europe that offer similar, comparable lifestyle that buying a property is probably a lot easier. And you can buy a home and still have that laid back lifestyle, the good climate, and so on. There's places like Greece, Spain, Portugal. They all have those little kind of similar Mediterranean climate type of things, old picturesque towns, beautiful landscapes. But yeah, you don't see people going to those places and buying this kind of decrepit house and kind of, working through it and having that whole transformation, which again is very unique to Italy.
I applaud the effort that they put into this whole €1 home or, cheaper and all that. But I think they don't provide the proper support system or have it in place just yet where they help you renovate the home, right? Like finding the people to work on the home and things like that. I'm sure some places that have become popular, it's a lot easier because there were trailblazers that came in from the US and, did their own thing, managed to work through all the red tape and set up a shop to help other expats or immigrants come to those towns, purchase those €1 homes and even help them renovate it, right?
Yeah, I think that's another sort of commonality that you see in these movies. There's this person who comes, and in both these movies, they come and buy this property. This town is sort of in need of some new life. So this newcomer is able to come in and create this community or a school or something that benefits the locals, and they're seen as this sort of like, I don't want to say savior, but there is sort of like an element of it that's almost implied in these movies. Like they come and help to revitalize the town type of thing. And it's, I think, also an interesting component of that. I also think it's interesting that in both these movies that we're looking at, they both buy the properties in Tuscany. So I think these would be very different movies if they bought these properties probably like in our area or even further down south.
Yeah, that's true. I think it'll be a lot more difficult to get things done. I'm sure it's not easy, even up north in some of those smaller towns, even in Tuscany. But it's kind of frustrating to see and sad at the same time because you have local people that may not have the means, but I'm thinking the willingness to help rebuild some of the towns that they were born in. It's sad to see that they have to rely on foreigners to come in and revitalize their towns, right?
So now let's talk about themes that we've seen in both of those movies, right? So Under the Tuscan Sun was from 2003. The other one, La Dolce Villa, is from 2025. So we're looking at almost 25 years in between the two movies. And I think it's a bit different, the whole part of how this purchase went and whatnot. But I think when you look at the two movies, they have very much the same formula, right? You have the main character who comes to Italy. It's usually after a personal crisis or something happens that they somehow end up coming to Italy, and they happen to find a rundown villa that's kind of charming, has potential. And of course, it's available, right? Like there is no obstacles. They can just get this villa and start rebuilding their life as they're rebuilding the villa.
Yeah, and I think there's always that portion of the movie where the dramatic renovations, they're trying to fix some beautiful portion of the home and they break it, and then all of a sudden they're able to easily fix it because there's some beautiful facade that's behind that damaged wall or whatever, right? And you always see the local communities are more than happy to help out and welcome the foreigners with open arms. Which the Italian culture is a bit different in different parts of the country, but generally you'll find that they're very open to most foreigners. But the way they portray it in the movies is a little overdone. I don't think you find the support system that you would see most times in these small communities that they portray in the movies. So, yeah, that's kind of my take on it.
I think it's also interesting to look at the process, right? So in Under the Tuscan Sun, like you said, there's the support system. The real estate agent just happens to speak English and is able to help her navigate the construction process. So she has all these different contractors come in, and of course, they're all like over the top and ridiculous. And then she ends up hiring this group of like foreigners. And it's not very clear to me how qualified they are. It seems very bizarre because they seem to be doing a lot of damage to the house. So again, I don't know how that works, but I think legally you wouldn't be able to hire people who have no experience with this in Italy.
Yeah, it's kind of confusing a lot of the time seeing that.
The other movie is a modern take, which I appreciate the fact that they switched the formula a little bit. So it's not like a woman coming into Italy dealing with some kind of traumatic experience. It's a man. So it's a father. I guess maybe he's in his 50s. He comes to Italy because his daughter decided to buy this one-year home, and he ends up coming to stop her. Then they meet this mayor who also happens to be a woman. I guess they're the same age, probably in her 50s, which is very different, right? Because you think this is Italy. She was married before. Her husband passed away, and so his wife did as well. But the mayor is, she's young, vibrant. She has these ideas. She doesn't have any kids, which I think is interesting, which is also very different than what we think of Italy and the Italian traditional culture. So I thought that was an interesting take on the storyline, because they could have easily done it the traditional way where this lady comes, mother comes after her daughter and the mayor is a man and that type of thing.
Yeah, there's some realistic aspects to that movie, with the daughter being of Italian background because the mom was Italian. You can kind of think that, okay, well, because of that, she's probably has her documentation in place where she can stay and stuff like that. But yeah, there's some interesting takes with regards to, their interaction with the mayor that's a woman and, not married and all that, and a free spirit and things like that.
So that's another thing that always bothers me with these movies that I keep saying to you all the time is, how are these people allowed to stay here? Both the main characters in these movies are from the States, and they don't seem to have any background or ability to qualify for European citizenship. Now, as you mentioned, the daughter, her mom was Italian, but that still wouldn't make the father Italian. So again, you come to Italy, you just buy a house, which does not equal citizenship. They can still be here for longer than 90 days. And I was trying to look up when this law came into place, but I couldn't find the actual beginning of it. But I'm pretty sure back in like 2003, that was still the case.
Yeah, I would say it probably would be even more strict than they are now. It'd be a lot harder to pull off what they were doing in the movie, right?
Again, that just boggles my mind because they never really address that, right? They never really kind of go into, oh, you're here for longer than 3 months. Like, what happens now? There is no immigration issues. You can just stay here and live here. Like, here's a year later, and you're like, everything is hunky dory. And I think that in itself might give people a very false narrative, right? Because you might think, okay, I'm going to come to Italy, buy this rundown villa, renovate it, and have like an Airbnb or something. But the reality is that you will not be able to stay here for more than 90 days unless you either have like a visa that allows you to stay here or you're an EU citizen. So, in that perspective, I just think these movies are just ridiculous because of that alone. Never mind the renovations.
Yeah, I think a lot of people online have this idea that they can just get away with staying here indefinitely without any issues. But there's a ton of work required to do that. I've even had acquaintances and friends ask, oh, I'm thinking of retiring and I'd like to purchase a home in Italy and to stay there. But, I explained to them, well, do you have any European background at all? Maybe you can apply for citizenship in one of your EU countries and then stay here long term, or even have enough money. Like, I think, as a retiree, I think you have to have a certain amount of money to be able to stay here, and it's not even indefinite either, right? So it's a lot more difficult than it looks.
So now let's look at the different aspects of what it's shown in the movie versus what our experience has been, because I think that's a really good way to show the contrast. I guess we should start with the bureaucracy, which Italy is famous for. The way it's portrayed in both of these movies is pretty unrealistic. Buying a property is not that spontaneous. The one where she just gets off the bus, gets into this house, and this old lady's just sitting there waiting, and the agent's there who speaks English. She just throws money at her, and boom, she has the house. That doesn't happen in real life.
No, not at all. The process is actually pretty complicated and kind of odd. It's not like back home where it's a lot easier. You don't even see the seller, right? The buyer and seller don't see each other most times, and it's all dealt through your lawyer and your real estate agent, right? But here it's a little different. There's back and forths, there's deposits that you have to leave, dealing with the notary where the buyers and sellers meet each other, and you go through this whole reading of all the legal documentation that you're going to be signing, and you're giving out your signature every 2 seconds on every document and triplicates and all that. But yeah, it is not at all straightforward.
I think there's a part where they agreed on the price and they go to what I guess is like a town hall. There's an issue with money or something. And the woman basically says to her in English, oh, don't worry about it. It's a house. It's not going anywhere. Here's your key. You're all good. You can just pay money later, which doesn't happen. You have to pay it first before you get the key. Another part that I thought was interesting was even though we were buying a house here, you had to be my representative because I didn't speak Italian. So in the movie, she just, throws the money over. They speak English. Everything is fine. But in reality, if you don't speak Italian, you have to have a representative like we did. The notary didn't speak English and I didn't speak Italian. So the sale couldn't have happened without the representative.
Yeah, exactly. You can't just sign over things without someone present that speaks the language. If you don't have someone that can fill that role, then you have to pay for someone to do that for you. It's a requirement. You have to have someone that understands the process, or at least is able to understand what they're reading and ask questions if you have to, stuff like that, right? So yeah, it's definitely not here's your check and I sign it over and it's done.
I think in the second movie, they were a bit better with that because by the time the father gets here, she says I already paid the deposit. I guess she used her credit card and deposit was made. So it's a bit more clear with the payment structure that he kind of helps her, which again, they don't really cover. So before she gets any kind of house, she's paid the deposit. Now, what I thought was kind of interesting is when they go into the in the movie in the Under the Tuscan Sun, when she goes into the villa and there's that old lady and she just keeps saying, make it double, make it double. And that made me laugh because I thought that's probably the most accurate part about it. Like if they think you want it, they'll just double the price.
Yeah, that's kind of an Italian thing, right? Once they see there's some interest, then you know, it's more expensive now. We're going to charge you more, even though prior to that, it was zero interest for the longest time, right? Then there's also the fact that it's not the same as what we're used to, where the payment is done through escrow, you wire the funds over and stuff like that. It's quite different. We had to get individual checks for every seller that was involved in this transaction. You have to go to the bank and get a cashier's check for each one, which was kind of odd for a house purchase, but that's the process.
I think what's different in the second movie, De La Dolce Villa, was that they were pushing the whole concept of the €1 home, right? So the town was selling these homes. She took both the father and daughter to different homes, which they didn't like. Then she's like, well, there's this other one that I'm going to show you. It's not official yet on the list. To me, that was just like obviously for the movie, because in reality, I don't think that's whatever happened. So basically, yeah, of course, they love this particular house. They get it. And then you have these heirs of property owners show up, and now they can't get the home anymore because the other people have ownership, which makes it a bit challenging here to buy sometimes because property is owned by multiple people. You have to have them all agree. And you hear stories of people who are, let's say, 3 siblings trying to sell a property, but one says no, and then you can't sell it. In our case, there were 3 siblings selling their parents' apartment, which is why we had to make all these checks. But I thought that was an interesting part of the movie.
Most times, these homes are sitting there for years and years, and there's generations of families that have owned it over time. Within the same family, people just leave and may no longer be even in the country any longer, right? So most times the town and the city hall would have to go out to those family members, get in contact with them and get the permission that's required to sell this home, right? Because most times they haven't been paying property taxes for decades or even longer. And it's not even worth it for them to come back and claim it most times. So what they usually do is try and get them to release it, and they make it available through this €1 home program.
That's one of the things that I always find fascinating. Like, if your grandparents left and this thing is falling apart, what can the local municipality do, right? Like, they have to do sometimes very onerous process to find these heirs. So that in itself is part of the bureaucracy. But another important part is that not everybody can buy a house in Italy, right? So again, you don't have to be an Italian citizen or an EU citizen to buy a home as long as your country has an agreement with Italy. If an Italian can buy a home in your country, you can buy a home in Italy. But if you're buying as a foreigner, there might be different fees, there might be different structure, different payment things that they never cover in the movie. They never covered that as that even being an issue. That doesn't even come up.
No, yeah, they don't go into those details. There's different tax rates for foreigners and residences. Obviously you pay more as a foreigner if you're not a resident, things like that. So there's so many nuances you need to keep track of.
Now, let's dive into the renovations themselves. Some of it was pretty hilarious, unrealistic, but at the same time, I thought some of it was not too far out. I know you disagree with me on certain parts, but I think not all of it was that far out. In both the movies, they have to renovate the home. In the first one, she has to find different contractors, whereas in the second one, it's the mayor's brother-in-law or some other family member who is this available contractor and can just come and start doing the work. In reality, it's very difficult to find people to work on your home. Even here, your mom has had how many people come and do quotes and they just never show up after to do the actual work.
Yeah, especially with those recent government programs, they were pretty busy, and these workers would end up picking and choosing their favorite contract, the one that pays the most. So the difference is the laws are quite a bit more strict compared to, say, 20 or 30 years ago. They do keep track of things. A lot of the times people would build a home however they wanted, totally different from original plans. And that would come back to bite you in your ass, right? So it's actually kind of funny that they're extremely strict now. If you want to do it by the book, you need to, you need to look into local laws, getting all the proper permits, knowing how things are done or even built in that region, right? There's certain things that has to be followed, certain rules in the way you build or remodel a home. So you need someone experienced in this process.
One of the things I thought was funny was that both homes have some kind of renovations that have to be done. There's always something that comes up. But when you look at the overall process, I think we've seen a lot more of those home renovation flipping shows that come up with more very costly issues during those renovations than they have in renovating these decades old or even centuries old homes in Italy, which is not really realistic.
Some of the things that you come across or people do in North America is quite a bit more difficult here. In North America, there's drywall. You can rearrange rooms and move doors around without having to worry about permits. Most times, it really depends on how big of a change you're making. If you're going to change the layout, you'll need appropriate permits. But small things like having a door, creating a new door, or maybe closing up a door, you need to get appropriate permissions, have permits, and most times you can't really do it. It depends on how much sunlight is allowed into the home, and things like that. It's like odd things like that we come across. So yeah, it can be quite challenging if you want to do it by the book, and you have to have someone that knows what they're doing guiding you.
Another part is getting the materials, right? These homes in the movies are in the countryside. They're not really that close to shops and home renovation type of shops. Even when we are right now, we've talked about it before. Where we live currently, the closest places are about an hour away. In the town we're moving to, everything is within 15 minutes. With these two movies, I find it interesting that they don't seem to have any issues with getting materials, especially for really old homes. Oh, you want these tiles? Oh, you want this brand new kitchen? No problem. It just gets delivered there. And I guess presumably they order things online. Back in like 2003, they probably couldn't. But again, she goes and there's some antique markets and like just finds this stuff. Whereas that's not always the case, especially if you are in a more remote location. It's harder to get materials. It's harder to get, even like finishing faucets or lamps or furniture or anything like that. It's a bit more difficult than they make it in the movie.
Yeah, I could imagine how hard it would have been in the early 2000s where you didn't really have online stores like Home Depot and Lowe's and Roanoke. It's more of a recent thing where they've done big box stores and you can order online. But back then it was unknown. That's something that wasn't possible, right? You had smaller stores that specialized in certain things and had to deal with people that way. And obviously, in remote areas, it'd be pretty difficult to do anything.
So these movies often focus on a person who comes to Italy after some kind of personal trauma or something that they're trying to pick up their life again kind of thing. I always find it fascinating that they arrive in a community already existing and then they end up building this community around them. Everybody starts talking to them and helping them out, and they're magically learning the language within like months or weeks, and they're just so fluent. They can talk with everybody. They get invited to all these dinners and homes. And I'm like, that doesn't seem to be very realistic, or at least it hasn't been our experience. People are pretty friendly here, but I don't see strangers saying to us, oh, come over for dinner and join our family celebration.
Yeah, you'll find people a lot more friendlier than you would back home, especially in larger cities. But it's definitely not how they portray it in the movies. You won't be walking down the street and someone comes up to you and say, "Hey, come to my house and have dinner," or whatever. People are generally very nice and happy to help out if you seek that help, but it's not very common to to find that sort of experience here.
I don't know. I'm just thinking maybe it's us. It's one thing we have made friends, we know people here, but I think it's very different. The way it's portrayed is very different because they are interacting with these locals and everybody seems to know them. Everybody knows who they are, which is true here too. Everybody knows who you are. You don't necessarily know who they are, but they know about you. These people start helping out. Everybody kind of has something to offer. And I just find it so unrealistic. Maybe, again, like I said, maybe it's us and where we live, but that really has not been our experience in Italy.
Yeah, I'm sure if there's a very outgoing person that interacts daily on the center square, just going up to people and talking to them and hanging out at the bars and, don't have a job or anything like that, then sure, it's possible that you'll gain friendships quickly and people will be willing to invite you over for dinners and drinks and stuff like that. But, reality is that people have jobs, people have a life, people have things to do. So you can't really spend that kind of time on town outreach, I guess.
The thing I do love about it, though, is that it's something that we've talked about before. I guess you have these foreigners, and in our cases, it's people who come from North America, where we work in a very different mindset, the way we approach business. So I think both these movies are sort of an interesting example of like a foreigner coming from North America who takes an opportunity, in this case, at the Crepit House, and then creates something out of it. So in Under the Tuscan Sun, she ends up creating this sort of community place for everyone to hang out. She unites the workers with the families. And because she's a writer, she has people coming to see her. In the second movie, the father used to be a chef. So he decides to transform this villa that his daughter bought, but he decides to help her transform it into a place where they can teach cooking classes and, of course, engages the local ladies and the local chef. The idea is that people will come to the town for these opportunities and offerings, and that will infuse some money into the town, which again, it happens. And I think a lot of foreigners who come to Italy end up finding opportunities to create either a business or start creating something, some kind of attraction that brings tourists in, brings other people in, and Italians themselves wouldn't have necessarily thought of that. And like I said, I always find that kind of interesting.
Yeah, there is the enterprising aspect of foreigners, and I think that's probably one of the main reasons that they have these deals where they have the 1 year homes and stuff like that. And they're going in the right direction with that because obviously most times foreigners will have the means if they are interested in staying in another country like Italy, right? So it's something they may be interested in doing and feel like if they can contribute in some way, they go ahead and try and do that, right? To revitalize a dying town.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the wherewithal they have with them, the infusion of that is also something that can help, right? Like the locals, if you've been living there and the town is dying, people are moving out, it's kind of hard to run a business. So I do think that the towns or the places that try to attract that sort of people into their town, I think those are the ones that are sort of changing the way things are done here in Italy. So now let's talk about the dream that is presented in those movies and the reality. We've talked about the things that are not necessarily how they are portrayed, but I think there's a big part of it that really is kind of similar. Like it's the beauty of living in Italy, the beautiful landscapes, being surrounded by these really spectacular landscapes, right? Like Italy is such a beautiful country. So just, living in a place that has so much history and so much beauty around it really is rewarding.
Yeah, I can see where there is that interest to slow down their pace in life. Most people that actually taking up this endeavor is to, you know, kind of slow down and get away from the stressful life back home. So most times you'll see that they pick up and find this new lifestyle, this new way of living. And yeah, I think that reinvigorates them and helps them get clarity in life, right? So they'll look to see how they can help other people at the same time. I think that's a common theme we've seen with many of the documentaries we've watched where most of these people do things for the local community to help the less fortunate or help with finding more work or giving them work, stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think there is certain beauty in finding something like a villa that's maybe falling apart and seeing the beauty that once was, seeing the potential. I think you and I have moved enough times and we've renovated enough homes that I don't think that kind of lifestyle is for us. We bought an apartment and it has to have some kind of renovations, but they're not as extensive, right? Like we're not renovating a whole house that needs to have a roof put on and walls and windows. It doesn't have that. And also, we would not really want to be buying in the countryside because we already live in the countryside and that's not for us. But I think for certain people, that is the appeal. And you could do it. It's not impossible. I just think you have to have realistic expectations of what you're getting into because the life, the whole process of that, not just the life in Italy, can be very different than what it is in the movies. It's not to say that it's all wrong. I just think it's not necessarily accurate.
So now there's some practical advice we can give you if you are considering this big step and moving to Italy. You want a budget, right? You need to know how much you want to spend. Do your homework beforehand because those €1 homes can end up costing you quite a bit more than €1. There are people that end up gutting everything and starting from scratch, having just the structure itself and everything else is replaced. And you're looking at hundreds of thousands of euros to get done. The older the place, the more work is going to be required. So, the simple things is redoing a roof or, building a whole new roof is costing you tens of thousands of euros, right? So you need to keep in mind how much you want to spend and how much you want to invest in of your time in rebuilding a home. There's times that you can get a little bit more expensive home than the €1 deal. Most times you can find places that are 10, 20, even 30,000 that you don't have to worry about replacing a whole roof, just some minor renovation work that you need to carry out. So, keep that in mind beforehand. Always look into what the costs will be, what your plans are. If it's just a simple redo of a bathroom and a kitchen, maybe some tiles here and there. Those things aren't that expensive, but you're still looking at a good amount of money depending on the type of quality of stuff that you want to replace it with.
I think that's a good point. And what I would add to that is always do your research. I would never recommend for anyone to just be, oh, I love this property here, take my money. Because in Italy, there are a lot of illegal properties. So if you buy a property that looks great and you want to, let's say, renovate it, or you might want to add something, you might realize that either A, something is built illegally, or it was not done properly. And now you cannot do that. So basically, you've wasted your money because you didn't do your research. And now you can't do anything with the property. I think that was always my biggest fear. That's why we had the lawyer do all that research before we even put an offer in, just to make sure that, everything was legally done and we had all the paperwork. There were no other people who can come and claim that they own this house. The idea might be tempting and you might see this house and say, this is I'm in love and this is it. It's probably a better idea to do some research before you throw the money at it, and you'll be happier and you probably won't spend as much money in the end.
One final thing, or at least a word of advice, is to brush up on your Italian language because most locals will be speaking Italian. They're not going to be speaking English, especially in smaller towns. You're not going to find real estate agents, builders, or workers that speak English. Even basic Italian is a requirement to get by, to be able to communicate. Nowadays, you have apps that help with translation, but you definitely want to be able to communicate somewhat in Italian with a local.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. As with anything in Italy, you should learn the language or make sure that you have people who can translate for you. This is our take on the movies versus reality. There's nothing wrong with dreaming about buying yourself a villa and renovating it. I think that's always a great project to do if you have the means, the patience, and you want to do something like that. This is just simply our take on it and a dose of reality if you're looking at buying a home in Italy, especially if you're looking at buying a decrepit villa that you want to renovate.